A millionaire CEO sits surrounded by luxury at the city's most exclusive restaurant, each table lit by crystal and soft music drifting through the air. Yet across the room, a little girl slips a folded note to the waiter, her eyes never meeting anyone's gaze. Something shifts. A hush falls. Why does her silent message unsettle the calm? What's hidden behind her quiet courage? And what truth is about to be revealed? If you believe that the smallest voices can hold the greatest weight, stay with us. And if this story stirs something in you, like, subscribe, or share your thoughts below, it truly matters. The Gardenia Grill stood at the corner of Fifth Avenue and East 52nd, its marble pillars glowing in soft gold, tall windows framing the throb of New York at dusk. Inside, velvet banquettes and glass chandeliers whispered of old money, old secrets, and the power of those who moved silently through both. Nathan Mercer sat at the center table under a spill of amber light, the silk of his tie pressed flat, every gesture precise. Around him, three bankers, two from Wells Fargo, one from Citibank, spoke in cautious, measured tones, their words flanked by laughter that never reached their eyes. Crystal glasses rang with subtle toasts. The air smelled faintly of roasted lamb and rosemary, and somewhere near the bar, a jazz trio kept a gentle, unobtrusive rhythm. Nathan's face handsome, serious. A little tired around the mouth was the kind seen on the covers of business magazines, the face of a man trusted with fortunes, the face of a decision-maker. Yet his gaze kept drifting from the neat stacks of contracts and the hush of ambition to the deep, untouched red in his wine glass. Around him, money flowed, careers orbited, but an invisible weight pressed between his shoulder blades. It was always this way at Gardenia Grill, where everything was controlled but nothing quite felt real. Halfway through the third course, as a waiter in crisp, white slid plates before each guest, Nathan noticed a slight disturbance in the napkin beside his plate. A small envelope, barely the size of a business card, pale yellow, clearly not from the restaurant. He glanced up. No one else at the table seemed to notice. The waiter had moved on, head down, shoulders tense. Nathan hesitated, a chill at the back of his neck, then slipped the envelope into his lap and opened it under the table. The handwriting inside was awkward, uneven, and spelled out with the honesty only a child could muster. My name is Grace. My mom, Emily, said she would leave if you didn't know me. Mom died last week. I am at Maplewood Orphanage. The words staggered across the paper, the ink smudged at the edges. Time caught. For a moment, Nathan sat frozen, staring at the paper as if it could dissolve, as if the name Emily Carter wasn't echoing in his chest, wasn't scraping open wounds he'd pressed down for years. 8 years since he'd last seen her. 8 years since a night in Central Park, a fight about priorities and sacrifice. 8 years since he chose the rise of Mercer Innovations over the mess of love. He'd read about her, sometimes, but he had never written, never called. He thought she had moved on, around him. The room faded. The bankers talked on about lending rates, about risk, about things that once kept him awake at night. But all Nathan could see was the uneven scrawl, the single line that closed the letter, "Please come." He folded the note in half, hands shaking for the first time in years, and looked across the restaurant. The waiter who delivered dessert lingered by the bar, eyes darting between Nathan and the door. There was a hush to the man's movements, a suggestion of knowledge. Nathan stood up too quickly, his chair scraping against the polished wood, causing heads to turn. "Mr. Mercer," one banker asked, surprised, his pen poised above a contract worth millions. Nathan barely heard him. The air felt thin, his thoughts tumbling. In a single breath, everything had shifted from the safe calculations of his public life to something raw, unpredictable, deeply private. He excused himself, voice tight. "I have an urgent matter." He caught the waiter's sleeve as he passed and whispered, "Did you put this on my table?" The young man, startled, nodded once and replied, "A girl. She asked me. She said you'd know." The chill inside Nathan turned to urgency. He strode out past the host's desk, the chandeliers, the faces that watched with a blend of confusion and idle curiosity. The city air hit him cool, tinged with November. Maplewood Orphanage wasn't far, a place he'd only heard of in the context of charities and annual galas. But tonight, it might as well have been 1,000 miles away. As his car pulled up, Nathan slid into the back seat, the city's lights rushing past in fractured streams. He gripped the envelope tight, reading the note again and again, heart pounding, not with anticipation, but with dread of what waited, of what he'd lost, of what he might finally have to face. In the rear view, his own eyes stared back at him, tired, unguarded, strangely hopeful. The negotiations at Gardenia Grill would have to wait. He never noticed how empty the restaurant felt behind him, or how the bankers tried to cover their confusion with polite laughter. Nathan Mercer was already gone, leaving behind the world he'd built for the world he thought he'd left behind. The car cut through the chill of late autumn, passing from the glitter of Manhattan toward the quieter edges of Yonkers, where the city seemed to fade into patient brick and the stubborn warmth of old neighborhoods. Nathan Mercer sat silent in the back seat, watching streetlights flicker over concrete. The note from Grace clutched tight in his palm. His driver, a man who'd learned not to ask questions, stopped at the curb just past a sagging iron fence and nodded toward the pale glow of windows ahead. Maplewood Orphanage stood apart from the world he knew, its facade worn but dignified, bricks darkened by years and rain. Light spilled through narrow panes where children's shadows moved, their laughter muffled by thick glass and heavy curtains. Nathan stepped out, shoulders tense beneath his tailored coat. He'd made the trip from boardrooms to ballrooms his whole life, but nothing had prepared him for the hush that met him here, a hush of old stories, whispered hopes, a hush that said, "You don't belong." He paused beneath a street lamp, drawing a slow breath. The cold air pressed against his skin, filled with smells of wet leaves, distant traffic, and something softer like cinnamon and old books. He rang the bell, then hesitated, listening to the sound of voices behind the door. He could hear children somewhere, the scrape of plates, the hush of bedtime routines. The door opened. Mrs. Bennett, the orphanage director, stood framed in the hallway's dim glow. She was a woman in her 60s, hair a soft gray, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. Her voice carried a practiced calm. "Can I help you for a moment?" Nathan hesitated. The words wouldn't come. He fumbled for his business card, then tucked it away. "My name is Nathan Mercer. I received a letter. From my daughter, Grace. She's here, Mrs." Bennett's eyes narrowed a little, not out of suspicion, but the careful caution of someone who'd seen too many promises broken. She didn't move aside. "It's late, Mr. Mercer. Most visits are by appointment, but I suppose this can't wait, can it?" Her tone was gentle, but it cut straight through his well-practiced composure. She motioned him inside. The air in the entryway was warm, laced with faint traces of cleaning powder and soup. Shoes lined the walls in tidy rows. A mural of animals and sunflowers stretched over one stairwell, faded but lovingly restored. Mrs. Bennett led Nathan past the common room, where a few children sat in their pajamas, watching a cartoon on a battered old TV. He caught the curious glances, the quick, private laughter as he passed a stranger in a suit, out of place among the worn furniture and bright paper lanterns. She brought him to a small office at the end of the hall. Inside, the walls were lined with drawings, crayon rainbows, stick figure families, a green lighthouse that stood out in one corner, a battered file cabinet and a desk stacked with neat files filled the space. On the desk, a photograph of a much younger Mrs. Bennett, arm around a child, both smiling in the sun. She gestured to a wooden chair. "Sit, please." Nathan lowered himself, hands awkward in his lap. The sound of children faded into a soft hush behind the closed door. Mrs. Bennett watched him for a long moment before sitting behind her desk. "You say you're Grace's father. I have to ask for identification." He fumbled for his wallet, handed over his license, and watched her scan it with a careful, skeptical eye. She nodded, set it aside, then opened a folder marked Carter, Grace. She read through pages, lips pursed, eyes flicking back to Nathan now and then. Emily Carter listed you as the father on the birth certificate. There were letters, some records from years back. Emily never spoke of you directly. She was private, fiercely so. Nathan listened, every word a weight. He wanted to ask 100 questions, but none seemed fair. Emily passed last week. He managed. The letter Grace wrote it, Mrs. Bennett nodded, a gentleness entering her voice. She did. She's resilient. But it's been a hard year. Your name has come up, quietly. I didn't press. It's not my place to force reunions. Nathan tried to steady himself, the old nerves of boardroom negotiations rising, then fading before something less familiar, a mixture of hope and shame. He glanced at the child's drawings, searching for clues, for traces of the life he'd missed. Is Grace here now? She is. Mrs. Bennett replied, rising. But I need to check a few things before I bring her in. We have procedures. I hope you understand. Nathan nodded, lost. He looked at his hands, noticing the tremor that had crept in. He felt raw, exposed, uncertain of every word. Mrs. Bennett left the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click, alone. Nathan listened to the house settle, the low hum of the furnace, the patter of little feet on stairs. The walls pressed in, heavy with stories he'd never lived. On the desk, beneath the paperwork, he noticed a small, folded note in Grace's handwriting. It read, "For Dad, in case he comes." And the words sank in deeper than any contract he'd ever signed. A minute stretched, then another. Nathan rose, walked to the window, stared out into the darkness, trying to gather himself for what came next. Behind him, the door creaked. He didn't turn yet. He let the silence hold, the weight of what he was about to meet, knowing everything might be different in the space of a single heartbeat. The door opened quietly, just a whisper on its hinges, and Mrs. Bennett entered first, her figure blocking the light in the hallway. Behind her, Grace appeared small and hesitant, arms tight around a folder of paper. Her hair was the color of honey in the late afternoon, a little tangled, framing a face much too solemn for her age. She glanced at Nathan with cautious eyes, the same deep blue that had stared back at him from a mirror decades ago. It was a detail that went straight through his composure. She clutched at drawing crayon colors, bright and bold, a lighthouse by the sea with two stick figures beneath a wide violet sky. Nathan stood, his throat tight, one hand rising in a half wave before dropping to his side. Mrs. Bennett's voice softened. "Grace, this is Nathan. He says he's your father." The girl didn't move closer, only watched him with that stillness unique to children who've learned to measure hope against disappointment. He tried a smile, but it landed crooked. "Hi, Grace. The words caught. Grace's gaze dropped to the floor, then back up, not blinking. Nathan saw the faint crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist, clear as a family signature. In his family, that mark was legend, a sign you belonged. The room held its breath. Nathan's mind raced. This was his daughter. There was no question now. Grace shifted the drawing, holding it toward him, not as a gift, but as a token that explained more than words. "Mom said you were busy. She wrote you letters, but you never came." Her voice was careful, light but edged with old hurt. Nathan took the picture with hands that weren't steady. I'm sorry, Grace. I should have come. I didn't know." She interrupted softly. "Mom said not knowing wasn't the same as not caring, but sometimes it felt the same to me." Nathan crouched to her level, searching her face for signs of anger, but found only questions. "Did your mom talk about me?" She nodded. "Sometimes. She said you were smart, that you liked lighthouses. She said maybe you'd find us." One day, Nathan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of what he'd missed: bedtimes, birthdays, all the small things that knit a family together. "I wish I'd found you sooner," he managed. Mrs. Bennett stepped back, giving them space. Nathan studied the drawing, saw the two figures holding hands beneath the lighthouse's beam, a beacon cutting through the dark. "You drew this." Grace nodded, her face unreadable. "That's me and Mom, but I can draw a new one. With you." She reached for his sleeve. Just a touch. Tentative. Testing. Nathan swallowed. "Grace, I want to get to know you. I want to be here now." He didn't promise anything more, afraid of promises he might not keep. She watched him, silent, then set her hand lightly atop his, her fingers cold, uncertain. "Are you taking me away, or am I staying here?" The question was small, but it rattled Nathan in a way nothing in his career ever had. He searched for an answer that wouldn't betray the tremor in his chest. "I want what's best for you," he said, his voice low. "I just wish I knew what that was." The space between them shrank, filled with the ache of missed years and the hope of something new. Grace nodded, her eyes finally softening, a flicker of trust passing through them. "Mom said families are supposed to try, even when it's hard." The clock ticked in the background. Nathan's mind spun with questions about school, about friends, about all the routines of her days that were a mystery to him. He wanted to ask them all, but sensed he'd get only so far on the first meeting. Grace's hand stayed on his for a moment longer, then slipped away. She looked past him, toward Mrs. Bennett, as if asking for permission she wasn't sure she deserved. "Mrs." Bennett stepped forward, her smile gentle. "We'll take it slow," she said, "but I think Grace would like to show you her room." Nathan nodded, unsure if he was ready, but knowing he owed her every awkward moment. Grace led him down the hall, past closed doors and painted walls, into the little world she called home. At the threshold, Grace paused, then looked back at him. "You don't have to come if you don't want to." Nathan hesitated, then followed her in, his heart pounding with the fear that one wrong step might send her running. The air was filled with the faint scent of crayons, old books, and the warmth of a small lamp. He stood by the door, letting Grace have the space to lead. She picked up a photograph, handed it to him, a faded shot of Emily, younger, laughing on a windswept pier. Nathan smiled, memories tugging at the corners of his mouth. He handed the picture back, careful, and let the silence say the things he couldn't. They didn't say much after that. Grace sat on the bed, Nathan on a little chair. He watched her color, watched her focus, and felt the world narrow to this fragile, private moment. When Mrs. Bennett returned, she found them like that, two strangers trying to remember what it meant to belong. As evening darkened the windows, Grace set down her crayon and asked again, quietly, "Will you take me away or leave me here?" Nathan didn't answer right away, his gaze steady on hers, the decision turning in his mind, uncertain as the tide. Nathan walked the polished halls of the Mark, the city's noise sealed away by velvet drapes and thick, sound-proofed glass. Even here, where the wealthy slipped quietly between suites and staff, offered comfort with practiced smiles, Nathan felt exposed. He entered his room, closed the door behind him, and stood for a long time in the hush. He could still see Grace's uncertain eyes, feel the weight of her small hand resting on his. For the first time in years, Nathan didn't turn on the television or check his phone for emails. He sat at the desk, the city lights glittering across Central Park, and laid the drawing Grace had given him beside a faded photograph of Emily. He opened the drawer where he kept papers from another life, a tangle of old resumes, report cards, and a battered manila folder he hadn't touched in years. His hands moved through the documents by habit, but his mind wandered. He pulled out an envelope, yellowed at the edges. Emily's handwriting danced across the front. It was dated 8 years ago. He'd never opened it. At the time, he told himself there'd be time for that later, when things weren't so complicated, when success didn't demand so much of him. Tonight, there was nothing left to put between himself and the past. Nathan broke the seal, unfolded the letter, and let Emily's voice fill the room. She wrote about the baby, about her decision to keep Grace, about fear and loneliness, and a hope that someday, maybe, Nathan would want to know his daughter. She wrote about love, not as a weapon or a debt, but as a truth that lingered even when everything else faded. "If you ever feel lost, Nathan," she wrote, "please come find us. You belong with your child more than you know." His eyes burned. He set the letter down and looked out at the Manhattan skyline, lights flickering like distant signals. He realized then how many times he'd chosen work over everything else. All the late nights, all the decisions that seemed so important, each one pushing him further from the life Emily had quietly built without him. He almost put the letter away, but something in him resisted. He reached deeper into the folder, pulling out a second envelope, then a third. One by one, he found a stack of letters, some opened, most not all in Emily's steady script. Each year she had written him. Some were long, others just a note. In one, she described Grace's first words, how she pronounced lighthouse as house light, how she'd learned to tie her shoes, how she'd once asked about the man in the photograph on the piano. Emily never pleaded, never accused. She just told the truth of their days. Nathan read them all, one after another, his world shrinking to the quiet of the suite, the distant hum of New York, and the pulse of regret beating in his chest. With every word, he felt the gulf between who he'd been and who he might have been. It wasn't anger that filled him, or grief. It was something softer, more complicated, a sorrow laced with gratitude for a woman who kept a promise he'd never made. At some point, he realized hours had passed. The city outside had gone from gold to indigo to the black velvet of midnight. Nathan stood and went to the mirror. In the reflection, he saw the lines at the corners of his eyes, the gray at his temples, the years that had passed. He thought of Grace, waiting for answers he'd never been brave enough to give. He thought of Emily, gone now, but still present in every small kindness, every memory she'd left behind. A decision settled in him, heavy and steady. He gathered the letters, tied them with a ribbon from the drawer, and placed them in his bag. Tomorrow, he would return to Maplewood Orphanage not as a man haunted by the past, but as a father ready to try. He would not ask for forgiveness, only a chance to be there. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe, for the first time, it was the right place to start. Outside, the city whispered on, alive and indifferent. Nathan stood by the window, letters pressed to his chest, watching the night. Down below, a taxi's horn echoed, lonely and urgent, as if calling him somewhere he'd always meant to go. Morning in Yonkers had a raw chill, the kind that clung even as sunlight slipped between narrow row houses. Maplewood Orphanage looked gentler by day, less imposing, its red bricks softened by dew and a line of children's drawings taped to the front door. Nathan arrived alone, carrying the bundle of Emily's letters in a leather folder pressed close to his chest. He paused on the stoop, listening to the distant laughter and the scrape of a broom just inside, letting the moment anchor him. The night had stripped away his defenses. Sleep had been thin. Regret was a weight in his chest. Mrs. Bennett welcomed him in with a nod, her hair neat in a bun, her cardigan the color of faded lavender. She led him past the smell of toast and coffee drifting from the kitchen, past a group of children threading beads onto string. Her office, at the end of a short hallway, was bright with morning light, dust motes caught mid-air. The window faced a back garden where two boys chased a battered soccer ball. Nathan stood, uncertain, as Mrs. Bennett motioned him to a chair across from her desk. She sat down, folding her hands atop a stack of paperwork. "You found the letters," she said, not a question, but a statement. Nathan nodded, placing the bundle on the desk between them. "I never opened them until last night. I didn't know." He trailed off, the words brittle. "I didn't know how much I'd missed." Mrs. Bennett listened in silence, letting him find his place. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but steady. Emily was proud. She rarely asked for help. She'd come to us first as a volunteer. When Grace was small, she kept her troubles to herself, but we saw her pain, especially after Grace's 5th birthday, when her health began to slip. She hesitated, eyes distant. Emily left Grace here last spring. She said she was going to the hospital, but I believe she knew she wouldn't be back. She packed Grace's bag with photographs, letters, and her favorite books. She wanted Grace to have roots, even if it wasn't with her. Nathan listened, hands clenched in his lap, guilt pricking at the edges of his composure. Why didn't she reach out to me, Mrs.? Bennett looked at him, steady. Sometimes pride is all we have left. Sometimes we think we're protecting those we love. She reached into a drawer, pulling out an envelope thick with old photographs. She slid it across the desk. Emily never let go of your memory. Nathan, these are for you. For Grace, too. One day. Nathan thumbed through the picture shots of Emily laughing at a park in Central Park West. Grace on her shoulders. Grace and Emily beside a snowman in front of the orphanage. A younger version of himself at a campus party with Emily. His arms slung around her waist. In every photo, Emily's eyes were bright, alive. It was a past he'd put away, but she had carried it through every season. I'm sorry, Nathan said, voice rough, for not being there, for not seeing what was right in front of me. Mrs. Bennett nodded, accepting but not excusing. Regret is only useful if you let it guide what you do next. Grace is still here. She needs you now, not the man you were. Nathan nodded again, his chest tight. The pain of absence mingled with the possibility of something new. She picked up a thin file and laid it next to the photos. Grace has had a hard year. She's quiet, but she notices everything. She asks about you, though she's careful not to hope too loudly. She paused. She deserves the truth. She deserves to know she was wanted. Nathan swallowed, fighting to keep his voice level. I want her to come home with me. I want to try. I can't promise I'll get everything right, but I'll be there. Mrs. Bennett met his eyes, searching for something she could trust. It'll take time. She'll need proof, not promises. She's learned not to count on what people say. Nathan took a deep breath. I'll show her. The sunlight moved across the desk, illuminating the photo of Emily holding a toddler. Grace, Mrs. Bennett's expression softened, pride and sorrow passing through her features. Emily would want that. She fought for Grace's future, even when she knew she wouldn't see it herself. She rose and stepped to the window, looking out at the children playing. Grace has never stopped waiting for you. Nathan. She still looks out that window at night, hoping a car will stop and you'll come inside. Nathan felt the words hit, sharp and irrevocable. There was no path back, only forward now. Mrs. Bennett turned, her silhouette outlined by light. Go to her. Bring her something real. Show her she's not alone. Nathan stood, the photographs pressed to his heart, a resolve taking root where shame had lived before. He left the office, the sound of children's laughter growing louder, hope and fear tumbling inside him. As he crossed the threshold to the hallway, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what he would choose to do next. Late afternoon, sunlight slid across the city, catching on taxi roofs and glinting in the puddles left from last night's rain. Central Park in spring still held a touch of cold, the kind that made Nathan wish he'd brought gloves. He held Grace's hand as they walked past joggers and couples with strollers, past a saxophone player sending blues into the soft air. Nathan felt the unfamiliar eyes of the world around him here. Nobody cared who he was, but he could not shake the sense that he was being watched, that every gesture mattered in a way he'd never known in a boardroom. They settled on a weathered bench beside the lake, a few mallards drifting on the surface. The city hummed behind them, but the park felt like a hush, an old church that asked for quiet. Grace carried her sketchbook and a box of colored pencils. She climbed onto the bench, pulled her knees up, and opened the book to a new page. Nathan sat beside her, unsure if he should speak or wait. He studied her profile the way the afternoon light caught the gold in her hair, the small crease between her eyebrows as she focused. "Is this where you work?" Grace asked softly, her eyes on the lake. Nathan smiled, shaking his head. "No. My office is in a tall building with lots of glass and computers. It's not this peaceful." He watched her begin to draw, bold lines forming the base of a lighthouse. "I used to come here with your mom. She liked the boathouse, and I always tried to race the model sailboats, but she said I cheated." Grace grinned, the first real smile he'd seen, and bent closer to her page. "Did you?" she asked. "Maybe once or twice." Nathan's voice grew gentler. "Your mom was always better at letting things go." Grace picked out a deep blue and began to fill in the sky. "She said you were brave, but afraid of being stuck," Grace murmured. "She said you left Charleston because you wanted something bigger." Nathan felt the truth of it catch in his throat. "I did. I wanted to make something of myself, to be important. But sometimes when you get what you thought you wanted, you find out what matters most is what you left behind." Grace nodded, as if she understood, though her pencil kept moving. "Did you ever miss her?" Nathan closed his eyes. "Every day, even when I tried not to." The park's quiet wrapped around them. For the first time since Emily's letter, Nathan felt a wall crumbling, an old fear losing its grip. A breeze rustled the pages. Grace stopped coloring and glanced up. "If I get to come home with you, can I have a corner just for painting?" Nathan looked at her, surprised by the hope in her voice, the way she didn't hide it. "I'll do better than that," he replied. "I'll make sure you have a whole room. You can fill it with any colors you want." She smiled, shy but bright. "It doesn't have to be big, just somewhere that's mine." Nathan reached for her hand, felt her squeeze his fingers. In that simple connection, something shifted. He understood, for the first time, what it meant to be chosen, not for what he could provide, but for who he was willing to become. They sat together, watching the sun slip lower, the city's noise growing distant. Nathan talked about his childhood, about an old house with creaky floors in summer storms. He told her about nights spent reading by flashlight, about the day he left Charleston, and why he was scared of coming back to places that knew him too well. Grace listened quietly, absorbing the small confessions, letting them fill the empty spaces left by absence. When Grace finished her lighthouse, she showed it to him, proud and a little uncertain. The drawing glowed with orange and yellow, a beam of light reaching through the night. Nathan traced the lines with his finger, moved by the faith she offered in every stroke. "You're an artist," he said. "Your mom would be so proud." Grace ducked her head. "I just like making things brighter." The moment felt fragile, precious. Nathan wanted to freeze it, to hold on before the world intruded again. He glanced at the penthouse key in his pocket and pictured it transformed not a fortress, but a home. For the first time, he realized how much he wanted Grace there, how much he needed her light. A shadow passed over the water. Grace shivered and tucked her hands into her sleeves. Nathan put an arm around her shoulders, holding her close, feeling the promise in her question and the ache of his answer. "We'll make that room for you," he whispered, "and I'll be there every day I can." As they rose to leave, the city lights flickered on, one by one, and Nathan's mind turned to what came next. Lawyers, courts, a system that wouldn't care how much he'd changed. Still. Grace squeezed his hand, anchoring him to the present. He watched her, saw the courage in her small, stubborn hope, and knew he'd find a way to keep it alive. He didn't look back at the bench or the lake, but the image of the lighthouse stayed with him, a beacon against the darkening sky. Evening fell sharp and blue over Central Park South, lights glowing in glass towers as the city's pulse beat steady beneath the skyline. Nathan unlocked the door to his penthouse and led Grace inside, the soft click of her shoes on marble echoing against a silence that felt deeper than he remembered. The apartment was impressive, a place built to dazzle, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out on the park, abstract paintings in heavy frames, and polished wood that gleamed under modern lighting. But now, Nathan saw it through Grace's eyes, a space too large for comfort, too pristine for play, a place where laughter might bounce and disappear. He set his briefcase down, watching as Grace paused on the threshold. She looked around, wide-eyed but wary, gaze lingering on the grand piano, the glass-topped tables, the silent row of books. "This is where you live?" she asked, voice so quiet Nathan almost missed it. "Yes," he replied, feeling a flush of embarrassment. "It's home. Or it's supposed to be." Grace nodded, walking further in, her small hand trailing along the edge of a table. She paused at a painting of swirling blue and gold. "Did you make this?" Nathan smiled, shaking his head. "No, an artist did. I just liked the colors." She stared at it for a moment, then moved on, as if searching for something that belonged. Nathan took her coat and hung it in the entryway. He hesitated, not sure what to do next. At work, every moment had a plan. Here, he felt adrift. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Grace nodded, watching him. "What do you want for dinner?" She shrugged, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "What can you make?" Nathan stared at the high-end appliances, the stainless steel pots, the refrigerator full of things he couldn't name. "We'll find out together," he said, trying to sound confident. He tried spaghetti simple, safe. But the water boiled over, and he burned his hand draining the noodles. Grace giggled, covering her mouth. She offered to help, her fingers deft at twisting pasta, her patience steady where his failed. "Mom, let me stir," she said. Nathan watched her at the stove, small and sure, the kitchen suddenly warmer for her presence. After dinner half-eaten. But honest Grace wandered the apartment. She found the shelves lined with books, the stack of unopened mail, the old upright piano. Nathan watched her from the doorway, unsure whether to follow or let her explore. She moved with a quiet curiosity, inspecting everything without touching, as if waiting for permission. Then she stopped at the refrigerator, the stainless steel reflecting her face. From her bag, she pulled out the lighthouse drawing. Without asking, she pressed it flat to the door, using a magnet to hold it in place. The room changed in that moment, a spark of color in all the white and chrome. Nathan felt something catch in his chest. "That's better," Grace said, satisfied. "Now it's ours." In her search, Grace discovered a cabinet. Nathan had forgotten an old file chest, tucked beside his home office. She pulled open a drawer, finding folders labeled with names and numbers, papers from years before. "Who's Emily Carter?" she asked, holding up a folder thick with contracts and correspondence. Nathan took it gently from her, heart twisting. "That's your mom. We worked together, once." He sat beside her on the floor, leafing through the papers, seeing now what he'd sacrificed: contracts signed, opportunities chased, time measured in numbers, not birthdays. Grace read quietly, absorbing more than he intended. "Did you leave her for work?" Nathan met her eyes, unable to lie. "Yes, in a way. I thought it was the right thing, at the time." Grace studied him, her face careful and old for her years. "You can't work all the time now, can you?" Nathan shook his head. "No, not anymore." The doorbell rang, a sharp note in the evening. Calm. Nathan rose, nerves jangling. He checked his phone, an email alert from Carter Williams, Emily's younger brother. The message was brief, pointed. "We need to talk. I'm speaking to my attorney about Grace." Nathan stood frozen, feeling the floor tilt beneath him. He looked at Grace, suddenly unsure how to protect the fragile peace they'd begun. She looked up at him, waiting, her drawing bright on the fridge, her trust hanging in the air between them, asking whether he'd fight for her or let the world decide. The next morning broke gray and unsteady over Manhattan, rain streaking the windows of Nathan's penthouse as if the sky itself felt the tremor in his heart. He moved quietly, careful not to wake Grace. For the first time since she arrived, he left her behind, trusting her to Mrs. Avery, the housekeeper who kept to her own world, but smiled gently at Grace over the breakfast table. Nathan hesitated in the doorway, briefcase in hand, watching his daughter tracing the lighthouse drawing on the refrigerator with one fingertip. She didn't look up. Maybe she sensed his worry, or maybe she just knew how little words could do. His car slipped downtown through rush hour traffic. Nathan's mind jumped from memory to argument, his nerves humming as the financial district rose around him, glass, steel, and a current of ambition he once swam with, never questioning. Today, the streets felt foreign, as if he'd wandered into someone else's fight. Miller and Shaw stood on Broad Street, an old firm with walls lined by the kind of mahogany shelves and oil portraits that belonged to another century. The conference room, wrapped in glass and gray morning light, offered a cold view of the city. There was no comfort in that horizon. Nathan stepped inside. Carter Williams was already there, neatly dressed in a navy suit, hair combed precisely, the fatigue of grief masked by the stiff mask of duty. At Carter's side sat Ms. Larkins, his lawyer, posture rigid, folders stacked in front of her like ramparts. Nathan's own attorney, Mark Bennett, greeted him with a short nod. There were no friendly hands offered, no casual talk. Today, every word carried consequence. Nathan sat down, his heart beating in his ears. Carter spoke first, voice steady but tight. "You left Emily. You left Grace. I was there when my sister needed help. I paid for the hospital. I handled the arrangements." His words did not rise, but there was a sharp edge to every sentence, a ledger of resentment. "You don't get to waltz in now, Nathan, and pretend the past never happened." Nathan tried to meet his eyes, but Carter looked straight ahead. Nathan's own lawyer began outlining his willingness, his intentions, the suddenness with which Grace entered his life. But every answer felt too late, as if all the years of absence pressed against the glass. Carter's attorney cut in. "Mr. Mercer, have you ever supported Grace financially? Do you have any record of contact? Any proof that you tried?" Nathan shook his head. He had nothing but a stack of unopened letters and a hope that now felt thin. Tension wrapped the room. Carter's lawyer placed a sealed envelope on the table. "For the record," she said, "we have a DNA test, performed years ago, confirming Grace's blood relation to both Emily and Nathan. That's not in dispute." Carter's hand shook slightly as he added, "But as Emily's only living sibling, and the one who's cared for Grace, I have legal standing as next of kin, and I intend to exercise that right." Nathan could not speak. The air in the room thickened. Every detail of his life, every choice, weighed heavy in the silence. Ms. Larkins pressed further. "Given the absence of a formal custody arrangement, and with the suddenness of these events, we believe it is in Grace's best interest to remain at Maplewood Orphanage until the court can review both parties' claims." Mark, Nathan's lawyer, tried to argue Nathan's means, his home, the stable environment he could offer. But the room only grew colder. The law wasn't interested in sentiment or regret. Nathan stared at his hands, remembering Grace's touch the night before, the way she asked about a room of her own. Now, he could barely picture her in these glass and marble spaces. He felt like an outsider, his title meaningless, his power stripped away. Carter watched him, pain flickering in his eyes, something more than rivalry. A brother's heartbreak, a family split by choices made too long ago. Nathan wondered, for a moment, if Carter saw himself as a savior, or a guardian, or simply as someone determined not to fail again. The discussion looped, legal terms tossed back and forth, none of them touching the heart of what was lost. At last. Ms. Larkins spoke to the judge's recommendation. "Until the preliminary hearing, both parties are to refrain from contact. Grace will return to Maplewood this afternoon." The verdict fell like a stone. Nathan tried to breathe, but every inhale hurt. He stood to leave, forgetting his briefcase, the city's skyline blurring behind a sheen of rain on glass. He pictured Grace waiting for him at home, not knowing that the world was about to pull her away again. He left the building in a daze, words echoing in his ears until the court decides, until the court decides. Outside, the city thundered on, indifferent, while Nathan realized just how quickly a family could vanish. He didn't turn back, but the silence that followed was deeper than anything he'd known before. Grace was led back through the iron gate of Maplewood Orphanage on a late Friday afternoon, the November wind swirling brittle leaves along the cracked stone walkway. The brick house stood heavy and silent, its windows glowing gold against the dimming sky, but there was little warmth in the air. Grace didn't look back at the car. She hugged her backpack, small hands curled tight around the fabric, her hair in the loose wisps about her face. Inside, Mrs. Bennett welcomed her quietly, one hand resting on Grace's shoulder with the gentle firmness of someone who'd witnessed too many homecomings that weren't really home at all. Nathan stood just beyond the entrance, watching until the last bit of yellow light was swallowed by the closing door. He returned to his penthouse alone, passing the room Grace had slept in for only a few nights, the lighthouse drawing still taped to the fridge, its colors faded and out of place in the sterile kitchen. He sat on the edge of his bed that night, jacket still on, the distant hum of the city, no comfort against the hollow in his chest. He'd built his life on order, on not making mistakes, but he saw now that the cost was higher than he'd ever measured. That week, New York's media began to churn. One outlet after another circled the story Mercer CEO embroiled in custody dispute. Secrets from the past threatened the perfect image, orphan child's fate undecided. Photographers lingered outside Maplewood, flashes of light quick and cold as blades. Nathan's phone buzzed with calls lawyers, PR consultants, board members asking if his family's troubles would threaten the quarter's deals. He ignored most of it. He only wanted to speak with Grace. Their visits were rationed, supervised in a small playroom lined with donated books and an old piano, under the watchful gaze of Mrs. Dawson from Child Protective Services. Grace sat at the small table, quietly sketching a new version of her lighthouse, this one less detailed. The sky, a pale violet, the beam of light no longer reaching the sea. Nathan tried to ask her about her day, about friends, about what she wanted for Christmas, but the words felt clumsy and artificial. Sometimes Grace would answer with a shrug or a soft yes. Sometimes she simply kept drawing, her silence heavier than any rebuke. Nathan began to notice things he hadn't before. Grace's shoes, too small at the toes. The way she waited to eat until everyone else had started. The way she smiled politely at Mrs. Bennett, but never quite reached her eyes. Each little detail chipped away at Nathan's resolve, laying bare a truth he'd refused to face. Being a parent wasn't about showing up with gifts or plans. It was about standing in the gaps, again and again, even when you were afraid of failing. Mrs. Bennett. For weeks, a distant figure with her careful tone and exacting record-keeping started to watch Nathan differently. She'd been the one to question his motives, to insist on documentation for every visit, to quote policy and legal requirements at every step. But on a Thursday evening, after Grace went upstairs, she lingered by the hallway and gestured for Nathan to join her in the small office off the kitchen. She did not sit behind the desk this time, but stood by the window looking out at the last streaks of light over the playground. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "it's clear you've made mistakes, but it's also clear you want to try." Her voice lost its usual formality, replaced by something softer. "Grace believes people leave. She's not wrong. If you want to change your mind, you'll have to do more than just visit and make promises." Nathan looked at her, uncertain. "What am I supposed to do, Mrs.?" Bennett handed him a worn folder inside. Instructions for filing a formal petition for custody, a list of social workers, counselors, steps he'd need to take. "You'll need to show the court you're ready to be her parent, not just her father. That means classes, references, and being honest about your past. I'll testify to what I've seen, but it's not about me, or Carter Williams, or anyone else. It's about Grace. She'll know if you're sincere." It was a shift Nathan hadn't expected from adversary to unlikely ally. There was no absolution in her words, only a path forward, rough but possible. The next afternoon, in the presence of a child welfare mediator, Mrs. Bennett spoke in Nathan's favor, noting the change she'd observed. It wasn't enough to sway the decision, but it opened a door he'd thought had slammed shut. Nathan left Maplewood that day with the paperwork clutched in his hand, his mind racing through every error, every step he'd have to take. As he walked down the steps, Mrs. Bennett called after him, her voice just loud enough to carry. "You want to win her back? Show her you've changed. Money and power don't mean a thing if your heart's still locked away." Nathan paused at the gate, the city flickering beyond the iron bars, and realized it was hope, however faint, that kept him moving. The next Monday morning, Nathan Mercer stood by the tinted window of his office, high above Hudson Yards, watching the city crawl awake under a pale sky. Outside, reporters gathered in a knot on the sidewalk, some holding up photos of Grace, others shouting questions into the sharp wind. Inside, the walls of Mercer Innovations pressed in, every surface gleaming, every conversation reduced to whispers and glances. Nathan's phone chimed with news alerts and investor emails, all variations on the same theme. How much longer could he lead a company when he couldn't even hold his family together? Board meetings had always been about numbers, strategy, control. Now, every seat at the table felt like a jury box. The room was glass-walled, Manhattan's skyline an icy backdrop. Around the table, his executive team, men and women he'd trusted for decades, studied him with wary eyes. Some averted their gaze. Others, like Frank Hughes, pressed him about the press coverage and worried aloud about public perception. Nathan could hear the tremor beneath their questions, not just concern for the company's bottom line, but fear of being tainted by his unraveling personal life. Linda Farrow, the firm's chief counsel, broke the pattern. A woman in her early 60s with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for quiet integrity. She raised her voice above the usual shuffle of papers and laptops. "We hired Nathan for his vision, not just his record," she said, her gaze moving deliberately from one board member to the next. "What he's facing isn't a scandal, it's a test of character. If we can't stand by a man trying to do right by his child, what do we stand for?" The room went silent, tension giving way to a softer sort of reckoning. Nathan met her eyes, a silent thank you in his expression. Still, he felt exposed, every shortcoming magnified in the sterile light. He'd spent his life believing strength meant keeping feelings locked away, but that armor only seemed to make him more alone now. He realized the only way forward wasn't through silence or evasion, it was through truth. Midday, he made his decision. Nathan walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind murmurs of surprise and worry. In his office, he called Amanda Ruiz, Mercer's head of communications, set up a press conference. "Today," he said quietly, "I want to answer every question myself. No lawyers, no scripts. Just me." Amanda hesitated, then nodded. "Are you sure they'll ask about everything, Emily, Grace, the orphanage, the lawsuit?" "I know. I owe it to Grace, and to the people who believed in me." The next hours passed in a blur. Amanda drafted statements and fielded calls from journalists. Nathan rehearsed nothing, instead pacing his office, thinking of Grace's quiet eyes and Mrs. Bennett's measured words. The stakes felt enormous. Not just his job, but the chance to shape how Grace would see him years from now, whether as a father who hid behind lawyers, or a man willing to stand in the light, even when the truth hurt, late in the afternoon, with the winter sun slanting through glass. Nathan took the elevator down. The press was waiting, cameras blinking, microphones thrust forward. He paused at the door, his heart pounding in his chest, and for a moment thought about turning back, letting someone else handle the fallout. But he kept going, shoulders squared, not for himself, but for the little girl whose drawing was still taped to his refrigerator. Nathan stood at the podium, his voice steady but raw as he began. "I'm not here as the CEO of Mercer Innovations today. I'm here as Grace's father. Everything that's happened is my responsibility. I walked away from my family once, and I've spent every day since trying to be someone she could believe in. No title or share price means more than my chance to do right by her." He took every question, didn't flinch at the hard ones about abandonment, regrets, or the lawsuit. He told the world about Emily, about not answering her letters, about the ache of realizing too late how much he'd missed. Whatever it takes, court, work. Reputation, I won't stop fighting for my daughter. I want her to know that even if I fail, I never stop trying." As the press conference ended, Amanda caught his arm, her eyes bright. "You did what you had to." Nathan stepped out into the street, the last of the daylight fading over Manhattan, ready to face the consequences of his choice, whatever they might be. The gray November sky hung heavy over Freedom Plaza as cameras flashed. Reporters jostled for position, and the wind carried a dozen murmured questions through the crowd. Nathan stood at the podium, not as a CEO today, but as a man stripped bare by regret and hope. His suit fit him less like armor and more like a memory of who he once tried to be. He spoke slowly, every word weighed. "I failed my family. I failed Grace. I can't change the years I was absent, but I will not let fear or shame keep me from trying now." The crowd was silent, the only sound a bus rumbling past in the background. In the press line, a handful of child advocacy workers whispered to each other, their opinions divided. Some believed Nathan's words, others saw only a desperate public performance. The story had become bigger than one family. Headlines streamed across phones: Manhattan's power, Brooklyn's heartbreak, the American question of what made a real parent. At Maplewood, Grace sat cross-legged on the floor of the communal room, the television perched above the bookshelf. She watched her father's face flicker on the screen. The other children glanced at her, unsure whether to offer comfort or space. Grace pressed her fingers to the glass of a picture frame in her lap, her latest drawing of the lighthouse, its beam shining out into a dark and lonely sea. She didn't say anything, but Mrs. Bennett saw the hope in her blue eyes, a hope too fragile to speak aloud. That evening, as the day faded into a cold blue dusk, Mrs. Bennett finished her rounds and found herself drawn again to Emily's old file. It was thick with documents, medical notes, application forms, faded photographs. As she flipped through the stack, a thin, yellowed envelope slipped free and landed on her desk. She recognized Emily's handwriting at once. The letter was sealed but addressed to Nathan, dated only a month before Emily's death. Hands trembling, Mrs. Bennett opened it and found a notarized statement. Emily's signature below the words, "If anything happens to me, I ask that my daughter Grace be entrusted to her father, Nathan Mercer. I want her to have a chance at the life I couldn't give." There was more, a signed legal transfer of guardianship, stamped but never processed. Attached was a brief note from Emily's lawyer explaining that due to a clerical backlog, the paperwork had never made it to the courts. Somehow, it had been filed away with the rest of Emily's effects, overlooked until now. The revelation hit Mrs. Bennett with the force of a sudden storm. All the meetings, all the arguments over Grace's future might have been avoided if this had come to light sooner. She called Nathan's number, her voice shaky. "Mr. Mercer, you need to come to Maplewood right now. There's something you have to see before court tomorrow. It changes everything." On the other end of the line, Nathan was staring at the city's lights, unable to settle, unable to sleep. When he heard Mrs. Bennett's words, hope and fear twisted together inside him. He barely paused to grab his coat, the penthouse echoing with the sound of the door closing behind him. In the elevator, his reflection stared back, older, lined, but alive with purpose in a way he hadn't felt in years. Down on the street, the wind bit at his face, but he moved fast, heart racing. There were no reporters now, only the silent city and the beating of his own hope. For the first time since the battle began, he felt as if the world might be turning in his favor, not because of luck or power, but because someone who loved Grace as much as he did had left behind the truth. Nathan pressed forward through the city, every step fueled by the memory of Grace's question, would he take her home or leave her behind? He had never wanted anything as much as he wanted to answer that for her now. The next morning, Manhattan Family Court was alive with a tense buzz, the kind that hung in the air before a storm. Camera crews pressed up against the courthouse steps, reporters calling out questions as Nathan stepped from the car. He wore the same suit from the press conference, the collar now loose, eyes lined by another sleepless night. At his side, Mrs. Bennett moved with quiet authority, clutching a worn file folder. Nathan's new attorney, Ms. Grant, walked just ahead, leading them through the lobby's echoing marble, inside the waiting room. Carter Williams stood with his lawyer, a young man in a crisp blue suit. Carter's face was tight, his jaw set, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of worry that crossed his eyes when Mrs. Bennett entered with that folder. Nathan tried not to meet his gaze, but in the mirrored glass of the hallway, their eyes caught. It was the look of two men who had lost more than they would ever admit. The courtroom was nearly full when the hearing started. The judge, a woman in her 60s, with sharp glasses and a voice that carried, called for order. All eyes turned to Nathan as he took his place at the table. The air was heavy, laced with the click of pens, the rustle of legal papers, and the faint hum of nerves. Testimony began. The lawyers volleyed arguments back and forth. Carter's counsel laid out a case built on absence, old wounds, and legal precedent. He spoke of Nathan's missed years, the uncertainty in Grace's life, and Carter's role as her uncle, the only blood relative present since Emily's passing. Then it was Ms. Grant's turn. She stood, holding up the letter Mrs. Bennett had discovered. With measured calm, she explained how Emily, facing illness, had chosen Nathan to raise her daughter should the worst happen. The judge asked for the letter. The room was silent as the pages changed hands. The judge's eyes moved slowly over Emily's words, the tone loving, but firm. Her trust in Nathan spelled out in ink that trembled only at the edges. There were more exhibits, medical records, proof of Emily's diagnosis, her correspondence with the old lawyer. Mrs. Bennett added her own statement, describing Emily's late-night visits to Maplewood's Gate and her hope that Grace and Nathan might one day be a family. For the first time, Carter's posture faltered. Then, as the hearing reached its middle, Grace's drawings were entered into the record. Nathan's heart hammered as he watched the judge leaf through page after page, lighthouses, family dinners, a tall man with tired eyes holding the hand of a small girl beneath the painted sweep of sky. Each picture, in its own quiet way, spoke what Grace herself could not say in words. As closing arguments faded, the judge raised a hand for quiet. Given the nature of this new evidence and the child's expressed wishes, I must review these materials thoroughly before ruling. She looked down at the last drawing, a lighthouse with three figures, one faded, one dark, one bright, standing together beneath the beam. Then she turned to the court officers and instructed that Grace be brought in for a private session. Both legal teams braced themselves. Mrs. Bennett leaned toward Nathan, her voice barely above a whisper. Just speak from your heart. Nathan, Grace will hear you no matter where she's sitting. Nathan nodded, his throat tight. He knew everything rested on what came next. The judge's gavel tapped once, echoing through the chamber. People gathered their papers, anxious for news. Outside, the city hummed on. But in that courtroom, time seemed to hold its breath for one child's answer. That morning, the marble halls of Manhattan Family Court were quieter than usual, as if even the city itself understood what was at stake. Nathan sat by the tall window, elbows on his knees, eyes tracing patterns in the white sunlight pouring across the old wooden benches. Each tick of the clock seemed to land heavy in his chest. When the elevator doors opened at the end of the corridor, Grace stepped out, a slender figure in the pale blue dress Emily had sewn for her last birthday. Mrs. Bennett walked at her side, hands gentle on Grace's shoulder. Carter Williams approached from the opposite direction, his face set with a kind of determined kindness, carrying the weight of his own conviction. Grace paused when she spotted Nathan, her gaze searching his face for something unspoken. Nathan nodded, trying to steady the tremor in his hands. In that moment, every courtroom whisper, every lawyer's brief, faded into the background. For him, the world narrowed to just the hope in her eyes. Carter knelt to Grace's level, voice low and measured. He spoke of family, of legacy, of the Carter name, and what it meant to belong to something lasting. Grace listened politely, but her hands twisted the strap of her backpack, her attention drifting back toward Nathan. He watched her lips move, but the sound was lost in the echo of polished floors and anxious hearts. At last, a court officer called Grace's name. The judge, a woman whose silver hair gave her an air of patient wisdom, invited Grace into the small, private consultation room. Nathan's breath caught as he watched his daughter disappear through the door. The minutes stretched on, each one laced with silent prayers and old regrets. Inside, Grace faced the judge across a sturdy wooden table. Her feet dangled above the floor. The judge's tone was soft, but clear as she asked about life at Maplewood, her memories of her mother, her feelings about Nathan and Carter, and what she wished for most. Grace hesitated, searching for words, then found herself reaching into her backpack. She pulled out her drawing, the lighthouse on the cliff, two small figures in the glow. Her hands shook as she held it up. "My mom used to tell me," Grace said quietly, "that someday my dad would come for me. She said he'd be the one to understand this light. That's why I want to live with him." Her voice broke a little, but she kept her eyes fixed on the judge, determined not to cry. "It's not that I don't care about Uncle Carter, but I know where I belong." The judge studied the drawing, her expression softening. For a moment, all that could be heard was the distant echo of footsteps down the hallway. Then, gently, the judge thanked Grace and promised her that her words would carry weight. When Grace emerged, the air in the corridor shifted. Nathan stood, heart in his throat, unsure if he should speak. Grace only smiled, small and brave, and slipped her hand into his. Carter lingered at the other end of the hall, his shoulders tight, then nodded, a silent truce. As they waited for the formal decision, uncertainty pressed down on everyone. The judge announced the verdict would be given the following day, so that all evidence, especially Grace's own wishes, could be weighed fairly. The crowd in the lobby thinned, leaving only a handful of worried faces: Nathan, Grace, Carter, and Mrs. Bennett stepped out into the bright, chilly afternoon. There was no celebration, no easy answer, only a long walk home, heads full of hope and fear. That night, Nathan stood by his window as the city lights blinked on, watching for a sign, any sign that tomorrow would bring them a chance to begin again. And just before he closed the curtain, he saw Grace's drawing on the coffee table, the lighthouse's beam cutting through the dark. The morning of the verdict, Manhattan Family Court felt heavier than any courtroom Nathan had ever entered. Rain streaked the courthouse windows, drawing gray lines across the city skyline. Inside, a crowd of reporters, lawyers, and strangers packed the benches, everyone craning for a glimpse of the man who once seemed untouchable. Nathan sat still, hands clasped around the edge of Grace's lighthouse drawing. He barely noticed the hum of whispered conversations or the clicks of camera shutters. His focus narrowed to the seat beside him, where Mrs. Bennett sat with a hand over his own, steady, warm, a silent anchor. His lawyer murmured last-minute reassurances, but Nathan heard nothing except the sound of his own heart, wild in his chest. Across the aisle, Carter Williams stood with his attorney, a mask of forced calm on his face. Underneath, though, was a kind of lost, weary resignation. Both men, Nathan and Carter, looked as if they'd aged years in a week. Carter's gaze dropped to the floor, then rose, searching Nathan's expression, as if for an answer to a question he couldn't voice. The doors at the far end of the courtroom opened, and the judge entered. All talk stopped instantly. Even the reporters lowered their pens. The judge took her seat, papers in hand, and surveyed the room with a long, measured look. She began not with the verdict, but by recounting the evidence: Emily's letter, Grace's drawings, the affidavits from Maplewood Orphanage, the testimony of both men. She spoke of Nathan's failings and remorse, Carter's devotion and sacrifices, and the loneliness of a child who just wanted to belong. Nathan sat up straighter as she mentioned Grace's wishes. She described the moment Grace showed her the lighthouse picture and how the girl's voice trembled, but never wavered. The judge spoke quietly of home, not as a place, but as a promise, a responsibility. Every word seemed to echo off the paneled walls and settle on Nathan's shoulders. The courtroom was so silent. Nathan could hear his own breathing, shaky and shallow. The judge paused, eyes sweeping the gallery, then settled on Nathan. Her voice softened. "Mr. Mercer, if this decision costs you everything else, your reputation, your company, your comfort, would you still choose Grace?" Her question rang out in the hush, stripping the room bare of all but truth. Nathan didn't hesitate. He met the judge's eyes and spoke, clear and certain. "Grace is the only family I have. Nothing else matters." The simplicity of his answer, said without flourish or defense, seemed to ripple through the courtroom. Even Carter, standing tense behind his lawyer, let out a long, ragged breath. The judge held Nathan's gaze for a long moment, searching his face for any flicker of doubt. Then she nodded once, slow, thoughtful, as if weighing a secret before closing the file. Instead of reading the decision, she announced that the court would take the matter under advisement for another day, to ensure every angle had been properly considered. The tension in the room broke like a wave. Some people muttered, others just leaned back, exhausted by waiting. Nathan's lawyer squeezed his arm, but Nathan barely felt it. Carter turned away, running a hand through his hair, his eyes red-rimmed but not angry. "Mrs. Bennett whispered that patience was its own kind of hope. No one moved for a while, reluctant to leave before knowing how the story would end. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the city looked washed and new. Nathan walked down the courthouse steps. Grace's drawing held tight to his chest. There was no verdict yet, only a fragile, stubborn hope stretching across the sky, waiting for tomorrow to bring its answer. The morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Manhattan family court, casting golden stripes across the rows of wooden benches. A hush had settled over the room, as if every soul there was holding their breath. Nathan stood at the front, shoulders squared, face set in quiet resolve. In one hand, he held Grace's lighthouse drawing, the other hand resting gently on her small shoulder. Grace looked up at him, her eyes clear, trusting then down at the scuffed floor, clutching the hem of her blue dress. Mrs. Bennett was seated just behind them, fingers tightly knotted in her lap. Her gaze flicked from the judge to Grace, to Nathan, and back again. Her lips pressed together, fighting emotion. Carter Williams sat across the aisle, alone but dignified, his jaw clenched, eyes bloodshot from another sleepless night. The air was so charged, even the clicking cameras in the back row sounded like distant thunder. The judge rose, straightening the black robe on her shoulders. She spoke plainly, without drama or flourish, yet each word seemed to land with the weight of a stone. After careful consideration of all evidence, testimony, and, most importantly, the clear wishes and best interest of Grace Carter Mercer, this court grants full custody to Mr. Nathan Mercer. On the condition, she paused, looking Nathan dead in the eye, that you are present for your daughter not just as her provider, but as her parent in the day-to-day. You will take her home, care for her, and remain accountable to this court. For a split second, no one moved. Then Grace let out a shaky laugh and threw herself into Nathan's arms. The sound was so pure, so sudden, that even the judge smiled. Mrs. Bennett wiped tears from her face, looking at the ceiling as if offering a silent prayer. The gallery erupted in a gentle, respectful applause, not loud or wild, just a wave of relief and approval. It was as if everyone in that room, from the skeptical journalists to the silent security guards, had needed this win, this rare sense that something had gone right. Carter rose, squared his shoulders, and stepped toward Nathan. There was pain in his eyes, and a flash of something that might have been envy, but mostly it was acceptance. He reached for Nathan's hand and shook it firmly. "Take care of her," Carter said. "That's all Emily ever wanted." Nathan nodded, his throat too tight for words. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the years of bitterness and misunderstanding collapsing into something quieter, older a recognition of shared loss and shared hope. Then, in a gesture no one expected, Nathan drew Emily's letter from his pocket and handed it to Carter. "This was meant for you," Nathan said softly. "I think family isn't about ownership or winning. It's about sharing, even when it hurts." Carter accepted the letter, his fingers trembling. "You'll always have a place in her life," Nathan added, his voice steady now. "That door will stay open. Grace deserves to know she's never alone, no matter which name she carries." It was a climax that felt more like a beginning than an end, a breaking open, a gentle undoing of all that had been twisted tight by fear and pride. Mrs. Bennett moved forward to wrap both Grace and Nathan in a hug. Reporters scribbled, flashes went off, and by the time the doors of the courtroom opened, the world outside already buzzed with headlines of the historic custody verdict. But for Nathan, all of that faded behind the simple truth in Grace's arms. He bent to whisper in her ear, "We're going home. We'll find a room for your art, just like you wanted." Grace grinned, her eyes bright and alive, in a way Nathan had never seen before. And as the three of them stepped into the sunlight, the past seemed to loosen its grip, replaced by the promise of a new kind of family, imperfect, fragile, but real. They didn't linger for interviews. Instead, Nathan led Grace down the marble steps, his hand wrapped firmly around hers, ready for the long walk back to a life that was finally, truly theirs. Dusk settled gently over New York City, casting the skyline in soft gold and violet. The penthouse at Central Park South, so often cold and echoing, now glowed with a different energy. Nathan carried Grace up the marble steps, her arms draped around his shoulders, a small suitcase bumping at his leg, for the first time since he could remember. The door opened, not onto silence, but into the sound of laughter, a bright, clear sound that seemed to fill every corner of the apartment. Inside, the kitchen was warm with the smell of fresh bread. Nathan moved about the stove, fumbling with a wooden spoon in a pot of soup, not caring that he had to check the recipe twice. Grace danced around the living room, her feet leaving light prints on the thick carpet. She paused by the window where the city lights flickered on, sketchpad in her lap, drawing another version of her lighthouse a little taller now, the beam reaching farther. Nathan watched her from the kitchen doorway. The apartment still held its old ghosts, stacks of unread contracts, old photographs, the grand piano collecting dust, but those ghosts seemed less sharp now, softened by the presence of his daughter. They ate dinner together at the small table by the window. Grace told him about her day, about Mrs. Bennett's visit, about her dream of painting a mural in her new room. Nathan listened, really listened, for the first time in years. Later, as they tidied up, Grace tiptoed to the fridge and placed her latest lighthouse drawing right in the center, beside the first one she'd hung. Nathan noticed her hands trembling just a little, her breath catching as she smoothed the paper flat. It was a quiet kind of declaration, one that didn't need words. The city outside hummed, a soft lullaby of car horns and distant music. Nathan tucked Grace into bed, sitting beside her on the edge of the mattress. The nightlight cast gentle patterns across the ceiling, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Grace broke the silence with a question so small he almost missed it. "Dad, will you always be here?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, the kind that lives only in the space between two people who finally trust each other. Nathan reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. He pulled her close, holding her until her breathing slowed. "I'll be right here," he said quietly, "as long as you want me." There was no grand promise, no speech, just the truth, plain and steady as the light from a lighthouse cutting through a foggy night. He stayed there, listening to her drift off, his hand resting on her back. The pain of the past, the sharp edges of regret, didn't disappear, but it faded a little in the warmth of that moment. He walked out to the living room, glancing one last time at the lighthouse on the fridge, the symbol of all that had changed, before closing his own door. Nathan paused in the hallway. The penthouse, once so empty, now glowed with a warmth that had nothing to do with chandeliers or expensive art. It was the light of hope, a soft, steady glow that promised, however quietly, that home was something they would build together, one ordinary day at a time. He didn't turn out the light in the hallway that night, and as the city pulsed far below, that golden lamp spilled its warmth into every shadow, waiting quietly for tomorrow to begin. A lamp still glowed in the window long after the city lights had faded, casting its small circle against the evening hush. Somewhere in the silence, two hearts learned to reach for each other without needing the right words. Maybe what lasts isn't the grand gesture or the loud promise, but the quiet trust built one evening at a time. Life rarely ties up every loose thread, but sometimes just having someone to wait with you in the dark is enough. And who's to say where the next flicker of hope will come from, or how quietly it might arrive?